I'm going to start from the Mishnah, if that's okay, because I think it's helpful for the Gemara. Just a few lines back from what he got up to.
Mhm.
A little hard to understand the Gemara without the Mishnah. So let's start from the Mishnah on Kuf Amud Bet, the bottom of the page. Hamocher zeitav le'itzim. Person sells his olive trees for the buyer to cut them down and use the wood for fuel for, I'm sure there's some olive fueled infused pizza or something, right? So you sell the olive trees for them to be cut down. But the guy doesn't cut them down and they produce olives. If it's pachot mi revi'it, if it's less than a revi'it of olives for each sa'ah, for each, space of the field, harei lo shabal zaitim. They belong not to the owner of the field, but to the person who bought the tree. But as we said, and of course, you learned the Gemara yesterday, but the Gemara is going to say because it's a trivial amount, so you just give it up. But if they make a revi'it, if they make a more substantial amount, then already it becomes a question. We just started, everyone, and we're reviewing the Mishnah from yesterday. So you sold your olive tree in order for the wood to be cut down and used for burning. If before you cut it down, the tree produced some olives, if it's a revi'it, the sa'ah, then you have a machloket. Everyone wants to take credit for these olives. Ze omer, the one who purchased the trees, who owns the trees now, says, Zeiti gadlu, my olive trees will cause this to grow. The Ze omer, and the owner of the land says, Artsi gadla, my land is the factor. Then yachloku, then they should split it. And the final part of the Mishnah, which is really what we're going to discuss today, is Shataf Nahar Zeitav. Let's say there's a big flood, and the river comes rushing down and uproots an olive tree from one person's yard and plants it down in somebody else's yard where it starts growing, which is not the least, it's obviously a Mishnah kind of case. I don't think it happens every day, but it's certainly conceivable. So then, so remember, now you have a problem because the tree is growing olives. One person owned, at least originally owned the tree. Another person owns the land, right? Who gets the credit? One says it's my tree, and one says it's my land. Says the Mishnah Yachloku, they split the produce that comes from that tree. Now, we'll discuss that all today. So in case that has happened to you, hold tight, you'll find out exactly what. Says the Gemara, Hechidam, Ida Amarle Kotes. Now understand, if I sold you my olive trees and said cut them down, Kotes la'alt, or cut them down right away, then Afila Pachot Nami the Baal Karka. So then it's your problem for not cutting them down. And the fact that you left the trees growing in my land is against our deal, and I should get to keep all the olives.
Isn't it against the Torah to cut down fruit trees?
So it's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I don't know the exact answer. That's why I don't want to say. I mean, I think there are definitely circumstances in which the trees are more valuable for their wood, in which case it makes sense. You can't cut them down unnecessarily, right? Baal tashchit is for no purpose. But the exact parameters of that, I think, are very complex. So I'm going to leave it for now.
Well, that's what we said. There may be yesterday. There may be cases where the tree is more important than fruit from the tree.
Correct. So if there's more value, but again, it's a little bit more complex, I think, which is why I don't want to say what I don't want to stare you wrong. So that's why I'm punting. But that's the flavor of the answer. Now 3 lines to the bottom. If the guy says to him, look, you bought the tree, whenever it's convenient for you, come and cut it down. So then basically I'm giving you permission to let your tree grow in my property. So then I feel the Baal Zaitim. Then basically the owner of the tree should get the olives. Well, the Mishnah is telling you, right, where you didn't specify. And the question of all our Mishnayot, we've had this for the whole parak basically, and continue, is what are the assumed, agreements? And therefore, Pachon Mirviyat, if it's less than a Reviyat, which is a small amount of olives, then lo kapti inish, then people don't mind. The one who owns the land doesn't mind that this guy is growing his olive trees on his land. But Reviyat, kapti inish, once you get to be a substantial amount, people obviously start wanting to lay claim to it. Amar Reb Shimon Pazi points out, of course, Reviyat Sha'amru, turn to the top of Daf Kuf Aleph, is chutz min ha'hotzah. That means a Reviyat net, not a Reviyat on the tree, right? It might be that you have to pay a sharecropper half the price to harvest the olives. It's not cheap to harvest olives. And therefore, you have to think of the Reviyat of value, not a Reviyat of quantity. Okay, so that is really what we were up to. I did it again just mainly because it's important to obviously have the context of the Mishnah for today's daf. Says the Gemara today, top line of Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. What about this case of Shataf Hanahar? right? So the river came and moved the olive tree from my property to my neighbor's property. Amar Ula, Amar Reish Lakish. Now, our Mishnah said Yachloku. Now, says Ula in the name of Reish Lakish, Lo Shanu. Our Mishnah only meant that you split the olives. Ela Shenekru Bigusheya. It's where the tree went from Reuven's yard, not the tree by itself, but the tree with its root bulb, I think is how you call it, right? The roots and the dirt around that. And as everybody knows, and Charlie most of all probably from the Mishnah and Demai, right? When you plant a tree, you're not allowed to eat the fruit from the tree for the first 3 years, right? If the tree is picked up and planted somewhere else, the clock starts again, except if the tree is picked up with its root and the dirt around the roots. So the Mishnah says if the gush, that's the word we use, right? The gush of the tree is brought with the tree, then it retains its status and the clock doesn't start over again, right? So now if this tree, says the Gemara, it says Reish Lakish, in the name, Ula, in the name of Reish Lakish, it only is true that you split the zaitim if the tree was nekru with its gush, right? And sorry, the Mishnah uses the word sela, is the word of the Mishnah, sorry. Gush is the Gemara word. Ula achar shalosh, and the tree is more than 3 years old, meaning when the tree was uprooted, it was edible because it was past 3 years. And after it gets deposited in the new guy's yard, it remains edible because it's not, you don't start the clock over. But if it was either picked up without the roots, meaning not the roots, without the dirt, meaning you have to start over, or even if it was with the gush, but it was within 3 years, so it's not permitted yet, then hakol shel bala zaitim. Then everything belongs to where the two people in this party are the bala zaitim, the one who owned the tree, and the bala karka, the one who owns the land. So then everything goes to the bala zaitim. Why? Damar le, because he could say to the person whose land it is, I'at natat, if you had planted an olive tree, b'toch shalosh, if it's 3 years less than 3 years from when you planted it, you couldn't eat anything. Mi havi achlet, you're not allowed to eat it. So the fact that now it's growing, you don't get to keep that produce. B'lei malei, why can't the owner of the land say back to the owner of the tree, ananatai? Yeah, it's true. If I had planted it, I couldn't eat it for the first 3 years. But you know what happens after 3 years? I get everything. I would eat everything. So now, within the first 3 years, we'll split it, right? Because after 3 years, we're going to split it because it's your tree and my land. So I should get extra rights within the first 3 years. Hashta ka'achlet palga b'hadai. I want to eat half of it with you. So it's true that if I planted a tree, I couldn't eat it for 3 years, but I don't understand why I shouldn't get a good deal from the fact that you are benefiting from a tree that's growing in my land. Ella, so you're right. Says the Gemara, you're right. That's not exactly what Reish Lakish said. Kiyata Ravin, excuse me. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Reish Lakish, no, this is what Reish Lakish really said. Lo shanu, it's only true, our Mishnah's rule that they split the fruit. Ela shenekru bigushayim ubetoch shalosh. It's talking about a case where the tree came up with its gush or its betoch shalosh, and therefore it is betoch shalosh of when it was uprooted to the new person's field, right? So therefore, it's within 3 years of the new field. It's permitted because it came with its gush, right? And that's where you split it. But after 3 years from when this tree was uprooted from Reuven's field and dropped in Shimon's field, hakol lebala karka, all of the fruit goes to the owner of the land, because the Amar Le, because the owner of the land can say to the owner of the tree or the original owner of the tree, if I had planted a tree, once 3 years were up, I would eat the whole thing. So I have no interest in splitting this tree with you. This tree fortuitously landed on my land, right? I thank God for that every day. And I'm going to keep the entire produce of this tree after 3 years. Within the first 3 years, I'll split it with you. Says the Gemara, but it seems like the owner of the tree is getting a bad deal. Why can't the owner of the tree say the exact opposite of what we just said before? I'at natat, right? He says to the owner of the land, look, if you planted an olive tree, betoch shalosh lahavi achlis, you wouldn't eat anything within the first 3 years, right? Now our Mishnah is saying that for the first 3 years, you get to eat half the fruit. Hashta ka'achle palga b'hadai, right? So why not, after 3 years, continue to give me half? Says the Gemara, Mishum da'amar, because you know what he could say, you know what the owner of the land would say to the owner of the tree? He could say to him, you're not really doing me any big favors by giving me half of the zaitim for the first 3 years. Because if I planted a tree, it's true, I cannot eat any olives for the first 3 years. But you know what I could do? My tree would be an immature olive tree, in which case it doesn't use a lot of energy, it doesn't have big roots, and it doesn't have a lot of shade. So I basically can use the land under the olive tree to plant my vegetable garden, right? Because your mature olive tree came and landed on my property, I can't plant anything underneath it. And so I get basically half the fruit because I'm losing from my ability to plant. That's the reason, not because you're doing me any favors. So let's read it inside. He could say to him, "I'ananatai, if I had planted a new olive tree, havi kitini, right? It would be tiny, it would be small, and therefore it wouldn't use a lot of shade, it wouldn't use a lot of nutrients. Vizarina tachtayo silka v'yarka. I would have planted underneath the tree, underneath this immature olive tree, vegetables, basically, right? So I would have, and things would have basically grown. So I would be capable of making more, essentially. Silka, I don't know how we translate silka usually. It's some kind of lettuce, right? Someone have an English for silka? Cabbage? Sorry?
Chard.
It's beets.
Oh, selek means
Yeah.
beet. That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the Koran translates it as chard.
Chard is not.
Chard is not the same.
Chard is a lettuce, right?
No, chard is
Yeah,
actually I mean it's
Like
it's a
spinach.
bitter lettuce kind of.
Yeah.
It's like it's longer. Beets have actually a long leaf attached to them. So
So
the
either
beet
way,
itself is the
actually-
root.
that's what you would plant under your olive tree. So the point here is that although I'm getting a lot of olives for the first 3 years that I wouldn't have gotten from my olive tree, I'm also losing the ability to plant under the tree, and that's why we split it. But after 3 years, the deal is up. Once your tree has landed in my field, and I basically, if I had planted a tree, I would have gotten the same thing out of it. I no longer have to give you any rights to this tree. You could file a claim with your insurance company. Okay?
He's claiming that he could plant something else instead?
Not instead, in addition. So if you plant an immature tree, if you plant a small tree, you can also, while that tree is immature, you can plant vegetables around the tree. Once you get a mature tree, of course, nothing grows under it. There's a lot of shade and there's less access. But what he's saying is that for the first 3 years, when you plant a tree, although you can't get any fruit from that tree because it's Arla, you can use the space under it in general. Now, of course, in this case, you can't because the tree that dropped itself on your land was a mature olive tree. So because of that, the owner of the land lost out on his usage of the land. And that's why he's demanding essentially half of the olives from the owner of the olive tree.
How could he plant something under the tree? Why isn't that kalayim?
So kalayim, you can plant vegetables, right? It's not.
I don't know. It depends on what you're planting.
Right.
Kalayim doesn't. Yeah, so the answer is that kalayim doesn't apply to planting things around trees. The kalayim of trees is grafting that is prohibited.
Okay, great. We got all our.
No, not necessarily. Not if they're fruits. If it's a fruit.
No,
tree.
but the beets and the tree cannot actually like merge into something else. That could never happen.
Right.
That's the
Whereas-
whole point.
whereas
You would have
if
to
you
have
graft
all my
a tree-
farmers here.
you would have to have 2 trees.
No, well, it's
with
not
2
farmers, it's
vegetables.
that It's that I went through Masecta Kalayim, and trees, for trees, the Kalayim prohibition is about grafting one species of tree onto another species of tree. You can plant vegetables in your orchard.
Okay, great. Tana, now, says the Gemara, very interesting Braita. Says the Braita, I don't know, we're like 15 lines from the top. Amar hala zeiti ani notel. Let's say Ruvain knocks on Shimon's door one day and says, there was a big storm last summer and my olive tree was uprooted from my yard and landed in your yard. Okay. I would love to make a deal with you, but it seems like we can't agree on a negotiation here. So I'm going to pick up my tree and leave. Okay. I'm going to take my tree and take it home with me. So I want to dig it up out of your field and take it home with me. Now, fine. That's what you say, right? Now, remember, the rule is, that's according to what we just said, according to Reish Lakish from our Mishnah, that for the first 3 years, they split the zaytim. After 3 years, all of the olives go to the owner of the field, right? So the owner of the olive tree is really being left out in the cold. So he says, this doesn't make any sense. I want to take my tree and I want to go home with it. Says the Gemara, you don't let him. Ein shomin lo, you're not able to. Tosfos does point out that probably you have to pay him something, which is now Gemara doesn't really address that. The fact is that it was his olive tree. It did end up in your field. There is some cost associated with this. But the point is that even if you have to pay him, he is not allowed to take his tree and uproot it. Ask him, why not? My time. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. It's because in Eretz Yisrael, we don't want you, this is similar to the question you asked before, right? We don't want you to uproot trees. And so we're afraid that you're going to uproot the tree and it's not going to survive the transfer. It's not going to do so well. If this tree, which was naturally uprooted, is surviving and thriving in a new spot, we don't allow you in Eretz Yisrael to uproot it and move it somewhere else. Amar Reb Yirmiyah, said Reb Yirmiyah, Kigon Da, for this kind of thing, Tricha Rabba, you need a great person to explain it. Meaning, we wouldn't have otherwise understood this halacha without the comment of Reb Yochanan. So that is the halacha here. Now, Tnanata, we have another Mishnah, which is no connection whatsoever to us. We'll see at the end why we're quoting this. But it's a Mishnah in Mesechet Demai, I believe. Where's the Mishnah? Yeah, it's in the 6th parak of Mesechet Demai. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says something very interesting. Hamikabel stei avotav min hanachri. Let's say a person has a field. We don't know what stei avotav means quite now, but we're going to see in a second. A field that's, let's say, ancestral land. Okay, it's a literal translation. And you accept it as a mikabel. Mikabel, remember, is like a sharecropper. It's a little different. There's different classifications of sharecroppers, but it's a kind where basically you agree it's someone else owns the land. I'm going to work the land, and I will give you, Rashi says, the situation here is you give him half the crops. It doesn't really matter what the agreement is. But you're going to work the land. You're going to do all the work. You might provide the seeds and the labor and the harvesting. And at the end of the season, you're going to pay the owner of the land half of the crops. Okay? So if you grow 100 bushels of wheat, you're going to give the owner of the land 50 bushels. Now, the question, which is, of course, the age-old question, is do you have to give it pre-tax or post-tax, right? so do you give maaser on you, and it's a non-Jew, right? So non-Jew, of course, doesn't have to give maaser. So you grow 100 bushels. Do you have to give the non-Jew 50 bushels, and he can deal with maaser? Or, as our mission is going to say, it's not what you do. What you have to do is maaser. First, you take your 100 bushels that you grew, take 10 of them off as maaser, and then you have to give the non-Jew 50. So you're only left with 40 at the end of the day, right? You got a pretty raw deal.
How does the non-Jew get involved in here? If this was Sedei,
well, listen, the Mishnah says,
that he inherited.
What? It's stay avotav that belongs to a non-Jew. So now, let's keep going. You'll see. Ask the Gemara, what does that mean? So Savru, we assume, what does it mean stay avotav, right? What is ancestral land? We think what that means is Eretz Yisrael, right? It means any land in Israel, or what they call Eretz Yisrael. And why are we calling it stei avotav? Am I calling it stei avotav? Because it's stei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, right? It's the land of our forefathers. It doesn't belong to a Jew. It was sold to a non-Jew. A non-Jew owns this land. He doesn't want to work the land. A Jew comes to him and says, I'll work the land for you and I'll give you half the produce, right? So then the question,
how can a non-Jew acquire land in Israel?
He bought it in the street. I don't know.
I thought we don't sell land to non-Jews in Israel. Land of Israel.
They took it from us.
Well, so we're going to get into all these cases today. But the non-Jew owns the land. The Jew does not own the land, right? This non-Jew owns this land. Maybe he stole it. Maybe he bought it. Maybe they had a war and he conquered it. And a Jew comes and says, "I'll pay you half." So his question is, right? Can you say, "Here's half the produce. You deal with maaser"? Says the Mishnah Demai, you can't do that because obviously the non-Jew is not going to give maaser, right? So you basically have to give maaser from this land and then eat that cost. So you end up losing a lot of money, right? It could be your whole profit margin. So now we think that stei avotav, like I said, means it's land of Israel. And Kasavar, and the opinion of this Mishnah is that ein kinyan l'nachri be'eretz Yisrael lafkiya miyad maaser. That is truth, as Ken just said, a non-Jew cannot really acquire land. Now, even though he has a document from the British mandate that says he owns the land, right? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything for maaser purposes.
Except
right?
we don't hold that way.
Wait, keep going.
In practice. Because the Heter Mechira is dependent on non-Jews being able to hold land in Israel.
Okay, correct. But don't worry, we're not at the end of the Gemara, and this Gemara, of course, is not the last word. But let's assume, says the Gemara, that ein kinyan. So the non-Jew, basically, although he owns the land, it doesn't really mean that he owns the land to make it patur from maaser, right? So a Jew working this land has to give maaser. Umikabel. Now, of course, the question then is, why would you have to give maaser on the part that belongs to the non-Jew, right? So remember, if the land was really owned by a non-Jew and I was the Jewish farmer and I grew 100 bushels, I should pay maaser on none of it, right? I should keep 50 and give him 50. So we must hold ein kinyan lenachri. So therefore, there's no patur for maaser. But then the question is, why don't you just give him 50 and you keep your 50 and give maaser on your 50, right? Because the Mishnah must hold that a mekabel kichocher dam, that the agreement of this sharecropper is the equivalent to an agreement of a chocher. And a chocher, there's different ways to translate it, but it basically means someone who agrees to pay a fixed amount, whether or not the field produces it or not. So unlike some sharecroppers in which, the field, if it grows 100 bushels, I give you half. If it grows 200, I give you half. The deal here, basically, I say to you is I will pay you for the right to work your field by giving you 50 bushels, whatever it produces, right? So that if the field produces 50 bushels, I give you 50. If it produces 200, I give you 50. In which case, my basic agreement with you is like a loan, right? I'm basically paying you 50 bushels in order to work your field for the season. But it doesn't mean that what I grew, 50 bushels belong to you and 50 belong to me. It means I have a debt to you of 50 bushels. So when I grow 100 bushels on the field, they're all mine as the Jew. I have to pay maaser on all of them and then take 50 and give them to you. So I end up with 40, right? So that's the second thing. Says the Gemara, Mikabel, a sharecropper in this case is kichocher dami, is like a tenant farmer. And machocher, just like that kind of person, bein avad, bein lo avad, ba yisuri, umeitinle, whether the field works or doesn't work, you have to pay. So therefore, you have to take maaser on everything. The chiporea chovatodam, right? When you are paying, you're basically paying off a loan. You agreed to a fixed amount. That's what we think it means here. And therefore, you got to pay it back. Af mikabel nami, so too, this sharecropper is like a lender, is like a borrower. Kiporea chovatadami, and therefore maaser v'noten lo. And so therefore, the explanation of the Mishnah is the reason that you have to do this. You have to take maaser on the 100 bushels and then pay the non-Jew 50 of those, right? And only keep 40 is for two reasons. One is that the non-Jew does not remove the requirement of maaser from the land. And your responsibility to pay the owner is not considered to be a sharecropping understanding. It's considered to be a debt understanding. And therefore, as a debt, you can't say, here's half the property, do whatever you want with it. You have to take off maaser and then pay him what you owe him. So that was the Mishnah. Again, this has nothing to do with our Gemara whatsoever. Amar le Rav Kahana the Rav Papi. Now, on this Mishnah, Rav Kahana said to Rav Papi, and Amar, some said Rav Zvid, he said to Rav Zvid, what about the following Braita? There's this is a Mishnah in Demai, but there's a Braita on the Mishnah in Demai, which says, Allah Hadatanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda, who's the Tan of the Mishnah, said, HaMikabel ste avotav, a person who agrees to work the field of their fathers, mimatzik nachri, from a nachri who's a matzik, I don't know how to translate that in English either, but like a violent criminal is literally what matzik means, right? Like
Koren uses the term, Koren
Oppressor.
translates it as oppressor.
Okay, that's what the word matzik literally means, right? So meaning someone who took it by force or someone who took a war, like obviously an unscrupulous non-Jew. So then maaser v'noten lo, then you have to take maaser and give it off. Now, according to this Braita, this is an important detail, is that the reason you're giving maaser is because the owner of the land did not come by it justly, right? Now, according to how you just explained this whole Gemara, it doesn't matter if the Jew bought it, if the goy bought the land fairly or unfairly, whether he took it by force or he took it by kindly paying you the real value, right? It has nothing to do with that. A non-Jew never acquires the land, and therefore you should never be patur from maaser. So your whole explanation doesn't make any sense according to Rabbi Yehuda's addition of the fact that the non-Jew is a matzik, is a oppressor, we'll call it, right? Says my area matzik. Why does the detail that the non-Jew is a matzik matter? I feel in matzik nami. Elo, you have to re-understand this whole mission. Olam, it's the way Charlie wants it to be. Yesh kinyan l'nachri be'eretz Yisrael afkim yan maser. The truth is that a non-Jew owns the land. And as long as the non-Jew bought it or stole it, remember, stealing gets a kinyan too, even though you have to pay back. And the non-Jew is the owner of the land. Nothing that grows on that land has to have maaser taken, right? A. Or it's possible that mikabel lav k'chocher dami, that a person who works the land is not like a chocher, meaning that I actually don't have a debt to the owner of the land. I just have to give him half of what I grew. So why in the world are you giving maaser then? Because the case here actually is my sdei avotav. It's not land of anyone in Israel. It's sdei avotav mamash. It's your own family's land, right? And this, of course, is what they call insult to injury, right? So the non-Jew comes and beats up your family and steals your property, and then allows you to work your land as a sharecropper and give him half the stuff, right? Which is unfortunately it's pretty common kind of scenario in those kind of situations. So
in Ottoman times, the Arab landowners did the same thing to the Arab who lived in the land. They didn't discriminate against us. They were not very well liked.
We feel much better now. So
yeah, well, they lived in Lebanon and Syria. They didn't live around there.
So that's where the Mishnah is saying although really halachically, you don't have to take maaser on this land because it's owned by a non-Jew, and a non-Jew doesn't have to do it. Because it's your family land, we want you to give maaser. L'didei hu de kansu rabbanan. Knas is a strong word here, but it means rabbanan added essentially midrabbanan to take maaser on the land, right? Why? Because they thought, look, if we say to any other person, you have to take maaser on this land, they're never going to work the land, because who would work their land and have to lose 10% of their margin? But because it's your family land, and therefore you're very connected to it, and you're familiar with it, and you live nearby, and you want to work it, the ID, the chavivi ala, tafi va'azel, and mikabela. Because since you really love this property, you will take a worse deal, and if the rabbis make you pay maaser, you'll accept that. So they only made this halacha on a person whose family land is owned by a non-Jew, not by someone who's a non-related party, because that person would never agree to pay this maaser, right? Aval inish ta'alma lo. But a regular person, because technically you don't need to give maaser because it's owned by the non-Jew, the Rabbanan wanted you to give maaser, but they only made that agreement, they only made that knas, I would say, not agreement, that responsibility on a person whose family previously owned the land. Ask the Gemara now, this is why we got to this whole answer. Why in the world do the Rabbanan want care, right? L'didei my timer consu Rabbanan. Why in the world did the Rabbanan say you should pay maaser? It's owned by a non-Jew, right? No one should have to pay maaser. Like, why in the world did they make this up to begin with? And that's what Rabbi Yochanan said, and that's why we're quoting Rabbi Yochanan again, Kitei shitehei bara biyado. We want it to be, the word bara means clear, like barak chama. We want it to be super clear in your hand that you're getting a bad deal, right? Meaning this guy, this non-Jew stole your land, and you're obviously very upset about that. We want you to redeem your land. And we know that people want to work their land. So Chazal are basically taking advantage of a person's sensitivity. We know you want to work your land. We know that if we put a 10% tax on you when you work your land, you're going to say, even though, of course, you have to raise 100% of the money to buy the land, we want to make it that much more unpleasant for you to be a sharecropper on your own land. So if we said to you, oh, it's owned by a non-Jew, you're putter from maaser, that might be a little bit of inducement for a person to say, I don't need to buy it back because I get out of paying taxes. So therefore, they basically assess the tax on you so that you would want to raise the money to buy it back. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan explained. And then on top of that, said Rabbi Yirmiyah, this is a quote of what we said earlier, Kegon da tzricha rabba. This is why we need a great person like Rabbi Yochanan to explain this interesting Mishnah in Gemai. And that's why we quoted this whole Gemara, just for that line.
It could be a disincentive. The person could say, I'm going to forsake this and I'll buy other land.
Yeah, but the psychology of a person is that they want to be on their family land. So that's what I just said. Chazal are essentially using your psychology against you. It's an unfortunate thing that this guy stole your land from you, but we want you to redeem it from him because we always want you to get back the land in Israel. And so it's true. It is an interesting approach to that, but that's Rabbi Yochanan's explanation. Itzma. Now let's get back to our sugya, right? Now remember, our Mishnah told an interesting case where an olive tree uprooted from my land and landed on Reuven's land and landed on Shimon's land. What about a more simple case, where Reuven goes on vacation to India for 10 years. Shimon sees his beautiful plot of land, and he goes down and says, you know what, I'm going to plant grapevines on that land, right? So he just goes into his field and he plants his trees in someone else's field. Of course, Reuven comes home 10 years later, and he says, 1 second, what are you doing? So it says the Gemara, Itma, Let's try to see what to do in this case. A person went into someone else's field and planted trees without any permission, okay? The owner comes back, and the question is, who pays what? So says Rav, Shaminlo, what you do is you evaluate how much value did these trees add to the field, meaning how much fruit do they produce, right? And what was the cost involved in planting them? And the owner of the field has to pay the amount it added, but yado al tachtona. But the person who illegally went and planted it, his hand is on the bottom. Meaning, if he spent $1,000 to plant these apple trees and they've produced $100 of apples, then the owner of the field, only has to pay $100. If, on the other hand, they produce $5,000 of apples, then the owner of the field has to pay him $1,000, which was his cost that he invested into the field. So he has to pay. And Shmuel says, no, I disagree. Or we'll see in a second. He doesn't disagree. But Shmuel says, Omdin. You know what you do is you evaluate. Kama adam lenota. Right? How much would a person, if I owned a field and I wasn't using it, I would go to the market and say, look, does anyone want to come and plant in my field? I'll pay you $100 a year. I'll pay you $5,000 to plant an orchard. I mean, what would a person pay for someone else to come to their field and plant? And whatever that is, that's what they have to pay Reuven. Because Reuven basically did that service for them. And says Rav Papa, just to clarify, Rav and Shmuel don't argue. Lo pligi, kan bisadeh suyalita. Depends on whether it's a field whose primary function is as an orchard, right? It's meant to be planted. That's where Shmuel said that basically you pay whatever you would have paid someone to plant your field. And Khan, Rav's ruling that you pay either the lower of the amount that the produce are worth or the amount that the person invested is bisadesh. You don't want anyone to grow your field, right? You would have never, excuse me, you want this field to be used for pasture. You want this field for some other purpose, and therefore it wasn't going to be planted. And Hadar Rav, now this comment of Rav, this halacha, was not beferish itmar. It was not said explicitly. Elam miklala itmar was said indirectly. The itahu da'ata the kamei de Rav. There was a story like this exactly happened. A person came in front of Rav, and he said to Rav, look, I just came home from a long vacation, and there's 20 apple trees in my yard, right? So what happens? I want this guy out of here. So Amalei zil shumlei. So Rav said, okay, go make an estimate of how much the person invested, right? How much they're worth, and you pay whatever value the person added for the field. Amalei, and so the owner said to Rav, Lobina, I don't want these trees in my field. I have no interest in them. So I don't really want to pay him anything. Amalei, Rav said, no, but you got to pay him something. So Zil Shumla, you go and you do the estimate. V'yadoa tachtana, I didn't clarify. He gets disadvantaged, meaning you didn't ask him to plant it, so you have to pay him, but you only have to pay him the lesser of the value that it gave to your field or the amount that he invested into the field. Amalei, the guy says to Rav, I still don't like that. Lobina, I don't want the plants at all. I don't want to pay him anything. I want these out of here. Now, Lesof, I'm not sure what happened next, but before they figured out the resolution, word came to Rav that this guy who came home from vacation and found these apple trees, he built a fence around his field. Chazia, he saw the Gudra, he put up a fence, the Kamanterle, and he started watching them, meaning he wanted the orchard. So he had been professing the whole time that I had no interest, but it turns out he did have interest. Amarle, so Rav said to him, Kalita adata, you clarified, you revealed the nichale, that in fact you do want them. And if you do want them, zil shumle, you have to go and assess how much it's worth, v'yado al yonah. And in fact, you have to pay him the greater amount. And the way we understand this is that this is what Shmuel said, basically. You have to go figure out, because essentially now it's becoming the field that you wanted to plant, right? So go figure out how much you would have paid someone to plant in your field, and that's what you have to pay, even if you used less money, right? So you would pay a guy $1,000, he spent $400 of labor, you got to pay him the higher amount. And this is how we see that Rav's halacha was not arguing with Shmuel. It depended on the context, right? If it's a field that you plant, you pay one thing. If it's a field you don't plant, you pay something else.
Why couldn't he say to him that this fellow is like stealing his field? What's the right that he has just to deposit himself in someone's field or someone's house? I mean, it's let's say he walked into his house and started using his china or his silverware. I mean, it's almost similar.
Right, but he added value here. I mean, he is stealing his field, just to be clear, but he added value to the field. So the question is, do you get that value or not get that value, right? So we understand with fields, at least, that you can't tell him to undo it, but you have to pay a minimum amount of value based on Metzia do al tachtona. Sorry. Itmar, we're in the fourth wide line. Itmar, let's say from the following brayta. What, this is about a field we've been talking about, but what if you go into your friend's abandoned property and you build a beautiful house, okay? The guy comes home and he finds his house here and he says, get out of my field. And I say to him, look, I built you a house, just give me $1 million, I'll give you the house. And the guy says, get out of here. So what does the builder say? He says, okay, I'm going to take my bricks and my stones with me, right? I'm going to take it down. So, you build a house in an abandoned field, not abandoned, in a broken down field without permission. And he says to him, okay, you don't want to pay me for it. I'll take my tree, I'll take my wood back. I'll take my wood and my stones back. Rav Nachman says, Shominlo, that's fine. You listen to him. Because, again, if they can agree to the price and he wants to pay the builder, that's fine. But if he doesn't agree to a price, he can say to him, I gave you no permission to come build on my empty lot. Get your property out of here and it's up to you. And Rav Sheshet says, Ein Shominlo. Says Rav Sheshet, you don't listen to him. And it's similar to what we just said, that you basically have to figure out how to pay him, but you can't, it's just like your olive tree. You can't just take your olive tree and go home. You have to come up with an agreement of either the Yado al Tachtona, but you have to pay him for some amount. Okay, says the Gemara, Lema, Meitve, thank you. One line up, 4 lines on the bottom. Meitve, there's a brayta that says the following. Shimon ben Gamliel says about this case, Rabbi Beit Shammai says Shomin lo. Beit Shammai says you listen to the guy, the builder, who illegally built the house and says, I just want my wood back and my stones back. Beit Hillel remains Shomin lo. And this is problematic because it seems like Rav Nachman, who remembers the authoritative psak, is going like Beit Shammai, who is not an authoritative psak, right? Lemer Rav Nachman, Amar ke Beit Shammai. And just going, no, there's another brayta. Hu da Amar Rav Nachman holds ki hatana. The Tanya, there's another brayta that says shominlo, that everybody agrees that if a builder says, I want my wood back, you just let him take his wood back. Divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and that's what Rav Nachman holds. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is the one who says that there's a machloket. Beit Shammai omrim shominlo, Beit Hillel omrim ein shominlo. But according to the first opinion, there's no machloket. That's where my havila. Now, what's the practical halacha? What happens if a guy comes or anyone comes and plants a tree or builds a house in someone else's property without permission? So Amar of Yaakov and Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha is, turn the page, bebayit. If you're talking about residential properties, then shominlo. Then if you can't have an agreement, if the owner of the land cannot agree on a price that he's willing to pay to keep this house, then the builder can just take his house, take it apart, and get out of there. Can't leave any mess behind them, right? So then shominlo. But if it's sadeh, ain't shominlo. But if it's a field and a person went and planted a tree and they can't come to an agreement, you cannot take your trees home with you, right? My taima, bisadeh my taima, Isham Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. It's a fascinating thing because, right? So because we don't want you to uproot trees and destroy them in Eretz Yisrael, even though you say you're going to uproot them and plant them somewhere else, we know what happens. You get delayed. It doesn't happen. It doesn't grow in the other place. If you have a thriving vineyard, you're not allowed to uproot it. Now, it's interesting because we allow you to uptake a house, right? Even though you could presumably say the same thing about a house, but we don't make you leave the house. Now, some say, no, it's not for that reason at all. It's mishum kachsha da'ara. It's because, look, if you plant in a field and then you uproot it, the land is much weaker than it was before you planted the tree, right? The tree has taken a lot of nutrients out of the field, a lot of the dirt out of the field. And so just picking up the trees leaves my field weaker. So a guy came to my field, planted his apple trees, left them there for 10 years. He can't just uproot them and said, okay, no harm, no foul, right? He weakens my land. With a house, that's not true. Right? If there's a piece of concrete and you build a house on top of it, and then you take down the house, you're left with your same piece of concrete, which of course they didn't have back then, but you get the point. So
they had it.
Okay.
The Romans had really good concrete.
Okay, so I guess they did. So Mishum Kachsha Da'ara and my Benai, what's the difference between these two reasons? It's obviously if you're not in Eretz Yisrael, and we don't care about Yishuv Bavel, right? Or Yishuv New York.
Right.
So then in theory, you can uproot the tree, but if I say it weakens the land, then that would mean that you can't do it. Continues the Mishnah. Hamaskir bait l'chavero, a person who rents a house to his friend. This is an enigmatic Mishnah. The Gemara will explain it all, but we'll assume at this point it means that you don't specify how long you're renting it for. You say, I'll pay, it's be $1,000 a month, but you don't say for how many months. says the Mishnah, Bimota Gishamim, if it's in the winter season, you cannot evict. This Mishnah is all about rent control. You cannot evict your renter from Pesach, from Sukkot to Pesach. You can't kick someone out in the middle of the winter. And we'll see in the Gemara because it's very hard to find a new place to live, right? It's not moving season. So you're not allowed to kick them out. But Bimota Chama, but if it's in the summer, then you only need to give them Shloshim Yom. You have to give them, well, we'll see in the Gemara, it means it actually does mean warning, but it is in effect for 30 days. Ubikrachim, but if you're talking about the big cities, now cities, as everybody knows, are super congested and very difficult to find a place to live. And therefore, you can't kick them out for 12 months. Ubechaniot, now if you're talking about commercial properties, you rent someone a store, then echad iyarot ve'echad krachim, whether you're in a big city or a small city or village, Shnei Masar Chodesh, it's also 12 months. Rashi has a beautiful explanation that, and the Gemara, I mean, it's based on the Gemara, of course, that most people didn't pay their shopkeepers, right? Because most people, like, I don't know if this is true anymore, but for a long time, right, you would buy things on credit and you'd pay when you get your income. And so for a shopkeeper to move locations could be very bad for your parnasa because people don't know where to come and pay you, right? It's like when you already move, you don't get checks anymore, right? So they were worried if you moved too frequently, of course, you would lose out on a lot of income coming in, and therefore you assume that the rental's for a longer period. And Reb Shimon Gamliel says, it depends on what kind of shopkeeper. If you're a chanut shel nachtomim, if you're a baker, or shel tzfaim, or you're a dyer, then it's 3 years, shalosh shanim. Gemara's going to explain that. I don't exactly know why, but for some reason those were things that people didn't pay that frequently. 3 years seems like a long time, but people would not pay their debts that often. Ask the Gemara, second to last narrow line, right? Right? Why are you saying that in the winter that you can't kick a person out? Because you must be saying now we think now that this means that I go to a person and say, I want to rent your house for the winter, right? For the rainy season. So that means the whole rainy season. So you can't kick me out. The agreement is the whole rainy season. So if I went to you and said, I want to rent your house for the summer season, why doesn't that mean the whole summer, right? Why don't you say the exact same thing in the summer, in the right, Yemot HaChama, which I'm translating as summer, but obviously means the sunny season. That you're renting it for the whole summer. Ella, you're right. That's not what it means. What the Mishnah means to say, the reason that in the Motzaei Gishamim you can't kick the person out before the end of the winter, right? It's because you don't, as I said, it's hard. It's basically renter's rights, right? The person did not specify how long, and so in the summer, it might just be 30 days. But in the winter, because it's very hard to find another place to live, you can't kick them out for the whole winter. It says Gemara, but then Ema Seifa, look at the next part of the Mishnah. It says, Bikrachim, if you're in a big city, right? It says it's 12 months. Now, 12 months does not say 12 months and the end of the winter, right? So let's say you rented something on December 31st, and the year passed, you can kick him out at the end of December, but that's the middle of the winter. And how's he going to find another place to live? You can kick him out once his rental's up, even if it's the middle of the winter. Why aren't you worried about the same thing? Why don't you say, it's hard to find a place to live? Amar Rav Yehuda, you're right. Our Mishnah is not referring to when you can kick them out. It's referring to how much notice you have to give your tenant before you evict them. It's literally, rent control here. Lehodia katani. It's telling me how much warning you have to give him before you're allowed to get him to leave. And Rashi points out, just for the record, right, that clearly you agreed on a rent that's per week or per month. So you have to keep paying rent. It's not like you don't have to pay, right? But it means you have to pay the fixed rent that you agreed on the beginning until a time when you say you have to leave. And this is what our Mishnah is saying. If a person rents a house to someone without giving a term, right, they just have a cost per time, you cannot kick them out in the whole rainy season, only if you warn them 30 days before the rainy season started. So Rashi speaks out the dates, right? The rainy season starts on Sukkot, which is the 15th day of Tishrei. So you'd have to give notice by the 15th day of Elul, right? And Tanya Nami Hachi, in fact, there's a brayta that sort of speaks this out very clearly. When our Mishnah says 30 days in the summer and Shnei Masar Chodesh in the big cities, excuse me, lo amru ela hodio. That's referring to notice. Kishem shemas. Now, interestingly, says the right, the kishem shemaskir tzarich lahodio. Just like the renter has to inform the rentee, right, that he's getting kicked out or he needs to find a new place. Kach socher tzarich lahodio. So the renter also has to inform that he's planning on leaving, right? Again, it's an open-ended lease. It says $1,000 a month, but you can't just say, okay, the month's up, I'm moving out tomorrow. Because the owner, the renter, can say to him, I think I'm using all my terms wrong, but the one who rented it can say to him, if you had warned me that you were leaving, I would have put up a for sale. I would have marketed the house. I would have gone and found good people to rent it. So you're really doing me a disservice by not telling me that you're planning on leaving on June 1st, right? So you have to give 30 days notice, and the owner has to give you 30 days notice that you're going to be kicked out. Amar Rav Asi, if you go in even one day before the rainy season, they cannot kick you out until at least Pesach. It says Gemara, one day. Our Mishnah said 30 days. Anan shloshim yom kamar. You're right. He means even if one day into the 30 days. So if he's one day late at giving you your notice, he can't kick you out until Pesach. But if the owner of the house says to you, okay, I can't kick you out, but I want to raise the rent, he's allowed to raise the rent. This is where that's ridiculous. That defeats the whole purpose, right? Where it uses a very crude explanation to say that. Amalei Rav Nachman, that's like saying, I'm going to grab you by your testicles until you sell me your shirt. That's literally what it means. Helenikte bekufse, by your kuvis, means your sack, literally, lishveke leglima, until you give me your shirt. Meaning, well, how could you say, I can't kick you out, but I can raise the rent as much as I want? Obviously, if I can raise the rent, that's the equivalent of kicking you out. I'll raise it to $10 million. That's why, no, it doesn't mean you could just arbitrarily raise the rent. It means that the actually real estate went up, right? There's been inflation. So, excuse me, there's been inflation, and therefore I can say to you, look, the prices of real estate have gone up 10%. I can't kick you out because you can't find another place to live, but you've got to pay me 10% more, which is pretty much how rent control works, I guess, right? With some more restrictions.
Mhm. Yeah, so Steinsaltz has a note that it also works the other way, that if rents go down, the renter can demand a decrease.
Right. It's true. Gemara doesn't say that here, but yes, that is true. Pshita. Now let's go. I know it's late. I want to get to the Mishnah. It says that we're at the two dots, sort of midway through the wide lines. Pshita. Now it's obvious to our Gemara, it's obvious to us as halacha, that if let's say again, this Rashi understands this all means after the rental agreement is over. So I agreed to rent it to you. I didn't say when it was up, meaning the year has passed, the 30 days have passed, right? And I say to you, nafal labeta, the minimum rental has passed, but I didn't give you any warning. And the owner of the house, his own house that he's living in, falls down. So he's homeless. So Amalei, he could come to the guy and say, look, your term is up. It's the middle of the winter, but you got to get out of my house because I have nowhere to live. So the guy's going to say to him, well, I have nowhere to live either, right? I can't find a house in the middle of the winter. The guy could say, but so neither can I. Lo adifat minai, you're not better. I don't have to treat you better than I treat myself. I've got nowhere to live. It's not my problem that you have nowhere to live because I don't either. But that's pshit pashatas. But it's also obvious to us that if Zabne, let's say the owner sells the house, or Orte, or you give it over to someone. Orte means to sort of give it over, or Orte means to inherit, right? So he either dies, I guess he dies, and goes over to his Yorshin.
But that's not sufficient time, not sufficient notice time, right?
Correct. So even without sufficient notice time, because the whole point of sufficient notice time is that a person can't find another place to live. But the owner can say to him, I don't have another place to live either. I'm in the same boat as you. And since we're in the same boat as you, I don't have to prefer you over myself, right? So, but let's say
How does Rashi say Hoyo behigia zmano motzio? Rashi seems to imply that the zman had occurred.
So no. So remember, there's two different parts here. There's a part where you agree to a certain minimum time, and there's a second part where you have to give a notice that you're going to end the thing, right? So this is what we said earlier. Let's say you rent a house, it's for 12 months, right? But after 12 months, the person does not leave on the day after 12 months. You have to give 30 days notice. Or if it's in the winter, right, you have to give 30 days notice before the whole winter. And the renter also has to give you notice. So there's a guaranteed time in the contract. Let's say it's a year. That even if let's say I'm the renter, right, or the owner, and my house burns down, I can't kick you out of the house. You agreed to it for a year. You committed to that. Beyond that time, that's the minimum time in the contract. The halacha of our Mishnah is not related to that. The halacha of our Mishnah is how much notice do you have to give. What our Gemara is saying is now you don't have to give any notice if you lost your own house. But if Zabne, let's say you sold the house, you the owner sold it to someone else, or Arte, you gave it to your inheritors because you died. Or you gave it away. In all of these cases, the new owner cannot kick the renter out either. Because the renter can say to him, you're not better than the person you got the house from. He couldn't have kicked me out. You can't kick me out without giving me 30 days notice, or if it's the winter, the whole winter's notice. Now, let's say the person doesn't die and his house doesn't burn down, but his son gets married. And his son now needs a house. So all of a sudden, his son needs a house. So can you say, I'm going to kick out the renter because I don't have to give it to him above my son? This is what we see. If you knew the wedding was coming and you could have warned the guy and given him 30 days notice or whatever notice you have to give, then that's your problem for not doing it. But if you didn't have any warning, there was love at first sight and you didn't have any notice, then Amrile, you can say to the guy who's renting it, Lo adifta minai. This is my child. This is me. I don't have to worry. I don't have to let you stay over my own family. Now, let's end tonight with one very interesting story of one unscrupulous guy. There was a guy, interesting guy, Dezavin Arba Dechamra. He bought, Arba means Arev is a boat, right? He bought a boat full of wine. So this guy tasted a wine at the market and he took delivery on the futures of, 10 million, I don't know, it's like 10,000 barrels of wine. And the wine arrives, and of course, he can't find a warehouse to store his wine. So he's in real trouble. He couldn't find a place to put his wine. So he hears that in town, there's a woman who owns a lot of property. So he says to this woman, do you have any place that you'll rent me for me to store my wine? He needed a big warehouse. And she said to him, "Lo, I'm sorry, I have nothing, I'm not interested in doing business with you." So he did what I guess many people would have done in that situation, is he proposed to her. So Azal and Kadsha, he married her. And of course, I guess everything changed all of a sudden once he married her. And and so she found space in her vast holdings for him to put his wine. So he put his wine in her warehouse. Of course, this guy was not a very nice guy. And he went home and he wrote a get. He wrote a get out, Shadala. He did not care about this marriage. He wanted wine placed. So he wrote her a get and sent it to her. Of course, she got this get in the mail. And I love this Gemara. Agra Shekuli Minebe. She said, look, this no good guy, he, first of all, is getting free rent in my warehouse because, when I was married, I guess it made sense, but we're not married anymore. And so I'm going to charge him. How'd she charge him? She took Minebe. She took from the wine, right? She took whatever barrels that she was due to her because of the time his barrels had spent in her warehouse. And then she said, and the contract is up today, Afikta va'otve b'shvila. She took his wine and stuck it out on the street. Right? So I love this Gemara, right? Amar of Huna Rav Shua heard about the story and he said she was totally right, right? Kasher asa, Kenya aselo, just like, sorry, I meant to say, she didn't give him money for the wine. She took the wine in order to hire the people to put it out on the street, right? So she used his money to move his wine outside. And said Rav Huna B'Rav Yeshua, Kasher Asa Keni Aselo. This guy, the pasuk as it says, like a person did, is treated him Lo Yeshuv Barosho. He got exactly what he deserved, right? And says Rav Huna, just to be clear, Lomi by Chatzer L'Kaim La'agra. It's not only the case if she didn't rent out her warehouses and he tricked her into renting it from her. Even if she has a sign outside the warehouse for rent, Amrle, she can say to him, you know what? I have no interest in renting this to you. I would lend my warehouse, I'd rent my warehouse to anyone in the world, but lecha lo nichli. I have no interest in doing business with you. Dildamili ki arya arva. You are like a lion who's waiting to capture me. And so therefore she has the right to say to him, I want nothing to do with you, and kick him out without any recourse. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, let's read the last line of the Mishnah. Shel nachtomim shel tzvayim shlosh shanim. And it says the Gemara Tana, the Braita says of Nesha Kifan Meruba, it's because they have a long time before they pay off their loans. So their debts go for a long time. Again, I'm not exactly sure why, but they go for a long time, and therefore it's inconvenient for you to move frequently because you'll end up not getting paid, and that's why the deal is presumed to be.
Yeah, there's another note at the beginning that says that the reason why they have a hard time actually moving is because they need a different kind of space, and they need water for the dye and all of these kind of things.
Right, but that's not what this means, though. I agree. That's another explanation, but this hekef merubah, right? Hekef means the time of a loan, essentially.
Right.
But yeah, what you're saying is a different explanation. I agree. Okay, sorry, I have a call. We're gonna stop here, even though we're not quite done with the daf, but we will pick it up tomorrow morning. 7:45. I'm sorry, Miriam, if that doesn't work.
But how does he explain the Rashi before? I don't, where Rashi says that he gives man of the contract.
Remember, there's two things. There's a contract time and then there's a notice time. Even when a contract is up, you can't evict somebody without giving them notice. So Rashi is saying that the Gemara is not addressing the contract. The Gemara is addressing only the notice. And that's what our Mishnah is. That's how we explained our Mishnah. How much notice do you have to give someone before you evict them, right? But the Gemara's point is that if you personally need the house, I believe that in rent control, they have this loophole also, right? If you personally live in the house, you can evict someone. People do this trick all the time, is my understanding, is that they move into the brownstone to get people out of it.
So if the contract is for a year, for 30 days or 6 months, whatever it is,
correct.
the time at the end of the year, you still have to give someone a notice?
Correct. They're completely
Yep.
separate. You have to give a notice. You could give it 30 days before the end of the contract, but the notice and the contract are completely separate. Yes.
That's
And
kind of standard in US law too, and for other
And
countries.
just to be clear, as the Gemara pointed out, and Charlie points out the flip side, you can raise the rent at the end of the contract, right? So even though you have to give notice, so you can't kick him out, you can charge him more if the rents have gone up.
Mhm.
So the contract guarantees the rent, but it doesn't guarantee that you can evict him.
So that person can remain there for another month then?
Correct. But, I mean, unless you give him notice, yeah. You have to give
Ah.
notice. You can give notice before the contract is up.
But at the end of the contract, how long can the person remain there?
As forever until you give them notice, but they have to keep paying rent.
Oh,
Um,
All right.
good night, everybody. Shavuot
Yasher
tov.
Good
Kol.
night.
Shabbat
Thank
tov.
you.
Can I just ask to most of us here, but on Shavuot, can we learn in person before Mincha? Is that everyone around? Anyone around?
That works for me.
Okay, let me.
I'll be here. I don't know if I'll. So what
I'll be
time would
here.
that be?
I have no idea. I have to check the time. So it'll be Wednesday and Thursday. I mean, I assume Mincha's very late, right? I mean, it doesn't get
Minka's
dark.
pretty
Yeah.
late, yeah. Well, it depends. The bet our Minka's going to be early.
I have to look at the calendar and see if HR has any speeches like what we have to work around. So, but I'm
Yeah.
here. I'm happy to learn in person on Wednesday. and Thursday.
Great.
Okay,
That would be
we'll figure it
nice.
out.
I thought David
Yasher
said
Kol.
he's learning on Shavuot
Oh,
before
well,
Mincha.
then maybe David's doing it. So I'll coordinate with him. We'll make sure. It'll all
Because
be.
he said he was going to learn in the lobby on Shavuot an hour before Mincha.
Oh,
Then
okay. So
that's
maybe
not
he's a step ahead of me.
happening.
Okay. Well, we're not both going to do it. But we will post on the WhatsApp which one. Good night. I'll see some of you tomorrow morning in a few hours.
Night.
Good night.
Shavuot.
Some of you. Not all of you.
All right,
I don't think I
Miriam.
could do tomorrow either.
It's my last class, so that's okay.
I'll have to catch on a recording.
I'm going to Muncie for a Vort in the evening. That's my excuse. So.
Okay, good excuse.
Good night, everyone. Shavuot tov.
Good night.